We feel very privileged to have a visitor with us today and to be able to welcome Emma Sabzalieva from UNESCO to the podium. Emma is the head of higher education research and policy at UNESCO, and she has 20 years of expertise in research, teaching, policy analysis, consultancy, and practice. She leads a range of international projects, including the right to higher education, the future of higher education, virtual student mobility, academic freedom, and self-regulation of higher education governance. And she is here today to inspire us and give us a presentation about the futures of higher education to 2050. So, Emma.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. I am what stands between you and the coffee break. So thanks for the scheduling. Thanks for the scheduling there. Listen, these plenary sessions that we've had, I've had the assistance of one of the colleagues who's been helping me a little bit with the translation. Unfortunately, my Norwegian is, non-existent. But I've been able to follow a little bit the conversations that you've been having so far today, and you've been exploring some very important topics for the government level at the institutional level. So what I hope to do now, between the coffee break and sort of building up on these kind of various opportunities and challenges for cooperation that you've been exploring, is in a way to kind of try to bridge a gap, I suppose, in a way. So what I'm not going to do over the course of the next few minutes is to tell you what 2050 is going to look like for higher education. I think the talks that we've had already and the situation that you're all going through shows us very precisely that nobody knows what's going to happen this year, let alone what's going to happen in 30 years from now. But what I can do and hope to do is to open a bit of space for you to reflect on how we might get to a future or a series of futures that would be a world that creates better opportunities for everybody, and what might be the role of higher education in that world. So, as mentioned, I'm at UNESCO. In fact, I'm at the International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, which we use the Spanish language acronym IASALC, but we work in English and Spanish, so I will not be presenting in Spanish. Hopefully English is okay. So we've been doing this work on the futures of higher education, which comes within the context of the broader UNESCO initiative on the futures of education. You'll hear me talk about futures in the plural. That's very deliberate because we want to recognize the fact that there isn't a single pathway forward. There isn't a single future that fits. There are contexts and cultures which are very different around the world. So the broader UNESCO work has been this global initiative to think about the role of education and how education can help to reshape humanity. And then in particular, we had published in November 2021 this report, Reimagining Our Futures Together. It's also known as the Sala Work Commission report for the President of Ethiopia, who was the President of the Independent Commission that worked on that. That was published, as I mentioned, just a few months ago, and in that they identify higher education as a catalyst for a necessary new social contract for education. So in our work at IASALC, within this broader initiative, thinking about the futures of higher education, we've been focused on creating visions for desirable future scenarios, so trying to move beyond this sort of business as usual approach. So we've had 3 phases in the work. The first has been an expert consultation that culminated in the report, the launch of the report Thinking Higher and Beyond in May last year, and the publication of 25 concept notes, which are all on our website, written by a global team of higher education experts. The second phase that I'll be talking a bit about today has been a public consultation. And the third phase, which we started in December 21 and have just finished a couple of weeks ago, has been a consultation with youth. So we engaged with around 200 youth, first through a global youth forum, and then secondly with in-depth regional workshops in Venezuela and in China. So we're working on sort of working out how we're going to publish the findings from that. So that's kind of been the extent of our work at IASALC on the futures of higher education within the context of UNESCO's work on the futures of education. So for the public consultation, we developed a survey. It was delivered to around 50,000 people. Now, of course, those of you who administer surveys know that the take-up isn't so good, although you do have the opportunity for reminders, I think, to ask people to fill those in. So it was a pretty simple survey. The first thing we did was ask people to kind of contextualize and to help them think about this 2050 horizon, to imagine themselves somewhat less now than 30 years ahead, and to think about what they're most hopeful about and what they're most concerned about in those years to come. And then the second two questions we used also in our expert consultation. So we wanted to carry forward the same question, and in fact we've used those same questions for the youth consultation as well, so that we can pick up quite different perspectives on how people would like higher education to be in 2050, and how higher education could contribute to better futures for all. So remember I said we're focusing here really on the kind of a desirable, a normative vision of, or visions of what those futures might look like. So methodologically, the public consultation was open for 10 weeks between May and August last year. It was an online survey. It was open to anybody. It was available in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Participants also submitted responses in Chinese and Mandarin Chinese. And the design of the consultation was done using principles of access, engagement, and flexibility to hear from as many people as possible. As I mentioned, it was available in multiple languages. We had a limited number of questions to try and encourage responses. It didn't take too long to complete, and there were also opportunities to give free text responses as well. So as a result, we were thrilled actually to have not quite 1,200. That would have been really nice to have 1,200, a much easier number to talk about, but nearly 1,200 responses from nearly 100 countries. Actually, it was 97 countries across the world. So actually, I think that indicates a very high level of interest in the consultation. Regionally, given that our institute has historic strengths in Latin America and the Caribbean, we were unsurprised to see that just over half of the responses came from that region. Then around 25%, around a quarter from Asia and the Pacific region. This is how UNESCO groups the world in macro regions, by the way. 13% from Europe and North America, 4% from Africa, and 1% from the Arab states. The survey was completed by people of all ages. Most of them were, I was going to say the most popular age, most of them were between the ages of 31 and 60. And in terms of gender, for every 3 women who responded, 2 men participated in the public consultation. So that's a little bit about how we went about doing the work. From the analysis of the response, this is the kind of overall, I guess, the tree that we designed to visually imagine our pathways to 2050 and beyond. Don't worry, it looks a little bit small because I just wanted to show you how it all fits together, but we'll go into the sort of different stages. So you start with the foundations, okay? So these form the foundations for the futures. Each of the 4 pathways represents roots, a root from which we can grow. So they're all connected. We have quality of life, social change, care of the environment, development of technology. So for each of those, quality of life refers to healthy humans living well. Due to social change, we live in a socially just society. Through care of the environment, we inhabit a flourishing planet that we take better care of, and where the advanced development of technology supports these harmonious relations with the self, with others, and with nature. So that's the kind of starting point for this 2050 series of visions. So let's think about the different roles that higher education can play in 2050. So based on what respondents said, we talk about higher education in 4 main areas. So we have higher education for all, student-centered, organization of knowledge, and connected at multiple levels. So what we did when we were writing up the findings from this, and to make sure that we really tried as far as possible to put forward the actual words that respondents were using, we've got a series of direct quotes in the consultation. So each of the themes that you'll see coming up as we subdivide the tree a little bit further are from quotes that people's responses in the public consultation. So the first here, higher education for all, means that in 2050, higher education would be available and affordable to everybody. Universities, colleges, other higher education institutions would be safe and welcoming spaces for all. More driven by social justice, higher education will be more inclusive and diverse in terms of learners, faculty, and staff. be more contextualized to current global challenges, more practical and experiential to include various academic and cultural offerings. But widening access to higher education should not come at the cost of quality. So that we parcel together in what we call inclusion with quality. So in 2050, higher education will nurture and nourish every student's talents and potential. So if you've ever wanted in your own professional development, in your own learning, to complete a course and work at your own pace, well, we're hoping in this vision that by 2050, that will be the norm for students, as higher education becomes more student-centered and more student choice-driven. So students will be able to actively participate in their own learning by choosing programs and courses according to their own interests and driven by their own personal growth. Students will develop skills for life and skills for responsible citizenship, which I think, given the discussions that we've been having today, is a very relevant point. And these will be useful not only to them, but to their local communities and in protecting the environment. But it's not just skill development. Students also will be driven by values-oriented action that will be at the heart of higher education institutions' missions. So this is a 2050 world in which society will be kinder and citizens will be more compassionate. So to make all of this happen, what changes might be needed in the organization of knowledge? So for a start, learning will be everywhere, offered in multiple modalities and formats, happening anytime, online, offline, as formal degree programs through informal learning. And to some extent, I think as we go through these visions for the future, you see that we've already started to do a lot of this work. And in your institutions, I think you may very well say, well, this is something we're already working on. Fabulous. So we also think, we see from the public consultation, we'll need more emphasis on training good teachers in higher education. So people who be committed to values such as respect, empathy, innovation, who take a creative approach to education and have more freedom to choose how to teach courses. More emphasis will be placed on diverse knowledge and ways of knowing, teaching, and learning that is widely accessible, focuses on the common good and on local and global needs. But it's not only teaching that will change. We see higher education being underpinned by innovative research that has an impact on society and is supported by governments. So cutting across all its functions, higher education will be connected at multiple levels. And again, I think given the topics that we're discussing, this is really crucial. So we see here higher education serving society in inclusive ways and helping to solve complex problems. Higher education institutions can improve the situation of the planet through educating students, through research, and by reaching out to the general population. And because we'll have this kind of global context with local essence, higher education will understand the challenges and opportunities of the local environment without detracting attention from global issues. So all of this calls for higher education without borders, right? Opening horizons, working collaboratively, continuing to work collaboratively even in challenging times, promoting academic mobility based on tolerance, respect, and the need of diverse communities and the planet. All of these areas, I think, set the scene for a range of desirable futures where higher education supports us and its communities in every step. So then the question becomes, how do we get to these futures which have been envisaged by the respondents to the public consultation? So based on that, we've put forward 6 calls to action. These are invitations to everyone, to decision makers, to institutional leaders, to academics, to administrative staff, to students, to teachers, children, adults. There's something in it, I think, that everybody could take up. So the first call is to advocate for the right to higher education. In the future, we think higher education's role for society and communities needs to be further expanded, and there need to be mechanisms in place to promote the attainment of this right. So second, the right to higher education goes hand in hand with addressing the barriers that limit participation. So for this, we think we need policy changes that support students to reach their full potential and to devise new ways to promote and to finance access to higher education. Those are some of the issues I think that need to be targeted to achieve this. Third, and here I think many of you will already be making steps in this area particularly, in terms of how we actively open up access to knowledge. So translating knowledge into different languages, knowledge of multiple languages, thank you all for already being on that path, publishing in open access journals, making course content freely available, using technology to reach remote communities. So I think here particularly, these are very pragmatic ways forward, and they're already achievable because we're already making steps in that direction. So fourth, we need to collectively empower the next generations to express themselves, to take leadership in their futures. I mentioned, for example, that we've also done a youth consultation as part of our work, and partly the reason for that is because participation in this public consultation by youth was quite modest, and we realised that wasn't good enough. So what can we do at UNESCO to empower the next generations? What can we all do to collectively empower these generations? We need to hear from young people when we design higher education. We need to hear from them because they will benefit from it next, but then they will also steward it for the generations that follow them. We need to strive for higher education to be more relevant, and for this we call on students and teachers in particular to push for changes in higher education, but with support, guidance and funding from civil society and from policymakers. And finally, and we hear this feedback a lot, well, 2050, it's another world, like we've just been dealing with this pandemic. Now we're dealing with other issues in 2022. I'm sorry to tell you that 2050 is closer than you might think, less than 30 years from now. And that's why we're advocating, it's a sort of methodological point, if you like, for everybody to become futures thinkers, to start to learn ways that we can think about the future, to anticipate those future challenges, but also to be able to push for them now. So that's a very quick overview, and hopefully something which kind of elevates us not away from the day-to-day, but to contextualize what we're dealing with now, to think about how do we take from that, how do we take from higher education now what's good? How do we stop doing things that aren't working for us or which are harmful, for example, to certain student populations or to our international relations? And what is it that we're not doing at the moment that we should be doing if we want to try and achieve this desirable vision? And what does that desirable vision look like in our institutions, in your institution, in this country, in other countries, in other places as well? So that's it for now. Very happy to take some questions and to talk this further. Just want to give a big shout out to the team that's been working with me on the futures of higher education. We usually give this presentation or versions of this presentation together, so it's very strange not to have them with me, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the work we've been doing. Thank you very much.
We will have time for some questions, so I hope you will take this opportunity to explore perhaps a bit more what it takes to become a futures thinker. I think as a representative from the Directorate for Higher Education and Skills, we are very interested in doing that and being futures thinkers. So any advice you can give to us would also be much appreciated. There are people with microphones ready to take your questions, so just go ahead. While we're waiting for people to formulate the questions, I'd like to ask you, because it's interesting when you present the report, it seems like visions and pathways for the future, as you have identified in your report, is pretty much the same across the globe, although we live in a very complex world. And how can we, as Norwegian institutions and authorities, play a part in securing that our higher education contributes to democracy, inclusion and sustainability, all these things that you mentioned for the futures. And in particular, this is the Panoramaseminaret, so in particular then through the cooperation with our partners in these Panorama countries. Well, what can we do?
Yeah, okay. I think the first thing to say on the sort of similarities and differences is, I mean, we've made this look very neat and tidy, of course, right? The tree image, it looks like everybody was on the same, literally on the same page. Of course, in any report, when you have to write something down, there's an element where you have to group things together and simplify them somewhat. So I think it's really important to say that there are actually some commonalities. When you look across age groups, across regions, across genders in terms of what it is that people are worried about, what it is that they hope for, there we do see some commonalities. But it is important to always bear in mind that the starting points and the context are very different. So I think that's I'm glad that you mentioned that. In terms of what Norwegian institutions, what the government can do next, in relation either to cooperation with the Panorama countries or more generally, I think there are sort of three things that I would put forward for consideration. The one would be, the mission, right? What's the bigger picture? What is it that you're aiming to achieve through this cooperation? And there, I think that's about really driving for mutual respect. The government, through Panorama and through the other cooperation programs, works with a wide range of companies. So I think countries, not companies. So sort of being able to, sort of have that level of mutual respect to say, what can Norway take to these countries, but what can we learn from working with those countries as well? I think having that as part of the mission, especially when we're thinking about, democratic values and inclusion and sustainability, that has to be at the forefront. The second would be about recognizing the fact that we have multiple knowledge traditions. I'm based in Canada, where, for example, we have, some outstanding, deep wisdom that come through to us from the indigenous populations that live in the country, but which are not actually very well reflected in higher education in Canada at the moment. So I could say I don't think Canada has done an excellent job of really respecting and seeing where we can learn from multiple knowledges. So that's another thing to consider, I think, when going into cooperation agreements is what kind of knowledge, where do we get that knowledge from, who's able to speak, literally sometimes, in order to put forward those points of view. And I think that for any cooperation agreement should be central. And the third would be about never shying away from the importance of critical thinking. It's a tradition which I think is quite strong in Norway, and I think that's a tradition that you can, carry forward with pride in cooperation with other countries. One of the calls to action that we have is about striving for higher education to be more relevant, and that comes from a quote. So I'm just going to read it here because I wrote it down. So one of the quotes that we had in the public consultation said that higher education must not succumb to the pressures of authoritarian governments or private funding interests. It shouldn't remain an ivory tower or a place of social reproduction, but a place for critical thinking, providing innovative reflections for a common, better future for the world. So I think taking forward that kind of spirit would be really important for cooperation as well.
Thank you very much. I think that ties nicely into the discussion about ethical considerations in international cooperation. But now we have two questions in the front here, and I think to the right you were first.
Yes, thank you. Two quick questions. I don't think you mentioned Russian as one of the languages of the survey. Russian is one of the UN languages. So that, of course, makes us curious with the discussion we just had. What is the place of Russian language, Russian institutions at UNESCO these days? The other question, you talk about barriers and removing barriers. I think many barriers in this world exist because some people benefit from barriers to other people. That's very clear in education, where you have some of the highest paid professions are often based on keeping people out of that education, those professions. So how do you bring down barriers when some people benefit very much from these barriers to other people? Thank you.
Do you want to take the answer first, or do you want to take the other question?
Let's take the other question as well, but thank you.
I could add on maybe it's a version of the barrier question. In earlier discussion, we had this analysis that some states now close down their knowledge systems and take control over research and education systems. In other parts of the world, maybe it isn't like that. So one question is, do the same happen to India, Asia, Africa, South America, as we now see with, let's say, China as a model? Do you see a trend of that? And if with that kind of idea, is your 28 years perspective ahead, is that more a vision and a dream? Or is it a realistic prescription? Because you describe a very open future, free flow of knowledge and understanding. And again, we observe new barriers today, which wasn't there 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Good, thank you both. Some really, I think, important questions. On a methodological point, we did not set out to make the survey in all 6 official UNESCO languages, so Arabic was also not represented. I think, as in any case, you do the best job that you can with the resources that you have available to you, which is my way of saying we thought 4 languages was a good start. And, I think what I've tried to stress as well is that the public consultation, I'm not saying that this is globally representative. There's absolutely no way that I would make that claim at all. But what I can do is share the findings from the group of people that completed that. I think in general, UNESCO was founded to generate a sort of culture of peace through education. That remains our mission. It remains absolutely central to what we do. So I think if you want to think about whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine or any other conflict that's happening in the world, that would be the position that UNESCO takes vis-a-vis Russia or anywhere else. And then you talked a bit about barriers, I think, and about, well, this all looked like a wonderful vision, but is it realistic? In some respects, I would say if UNESCO as a major international organization can't do the job of creating a vision and a dream that we could work towards, sometimes I wonder who will. Because we all sort of represent different interests and we all have different ways of thinking about the world. So this is a way of thinking about the world for sure. I like to think that it's a vision, but I wouldn't like to think it's only a dream. Because I think there's enough in this, and what we've tried to do, through our work in the futures is to break it down a little bit. We have to be careful because we don't want to say, in your university, this is how you should do it. In your country, this is how you should do it, because I don't think that would be reasonable, and I don't think that would be at all respectful. But what we can do, as we've tried to do from this public consultation, is think, what are some of the sort of larger guiding principles? How do we think about the future? So how do we think about the future? So one thing we're working on at the moment, for example, is developing a toolkit which can be used in a kind of workshop format or something else to help people think about how do we get to those futures. So how do we overcome barriers to do that? I think openness, continued openness, even in times of adversity, is critical. How do we break down the barriers when the colleague makes the absolutely correct comment that the people who benefit the most are the ones who benefit from the barriers being up? And I think openness is a really important way to tackle that. So when we're publishing, are we publishing the results of our scientific research in ways that other people can access? Are we thinking about how do we open up access to resources where those resources don't currently exist? I mean, our small contribution to this is that, the data set that we have from the public consultation is all available. So it's a small example, but I think it's a step in the right direction. So it's partly, I think, for us about modeling the sort of behavior that we hope that others would feel that they could join towards. So again, in a little bit of a way, it's about saying, okay, if we know that UNESCO is talking about this or is thinking about it in this way, then we have something there to say, well, we can work towards this as well, or we can work towards our sort of version of that.
Are there any other questions before we break, or is the pull of the coffee now so strong? And I think we will say thank you to Emma.